What if I told you that some people died in ways so strange, so ironic, and so unforgettable, that history still can't stop talking about them? A king who made himself immune to every poison on earth, only to be stabbed by a frightened teenager. A philosopher who laughed so hard at a donkey eating figs, that his heart simply gave up. And a Viking who won a battle, beheaded his enemy, and was killed days later by the dead man's tooth. These aren't myths. These are real deaths. And tonight, we're counting down the most epic exits history has ever recorded. Before we begin, if you love stories that make you say, "Did that really happen?" go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to Little Historical. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, dim the lights, take a breath, and let's walk through history's strangest final moments. What if I told you that a king once became so terrified of being poisoned that he turned his own body into a living laboratory? This was Mithridates VI, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Pontus. And his fear was not unreasonable. In the 1st century before Christ, poison was the silent currency of power. It slipped into wine, into bread, into the breath of a lover leaning close to whisper secrets. Every dinner was a gamble. Every trusted servant might be holding a vial instead of a tray. So Mithridates did something both brilliant and deeply unsettling. He began to consume every toxin he could find. A pinch of hemlock with his morning meal. A dash of arsenic dissolved in honey. A taste of belladonna that would have dropped a grown man to his knees. Day after day, year after year, he built what he believed was total immunity. His personal apothecaries created a legendary mixture called Mithridatum, a cure-all so famous that doctors would try to replicate it for more than 1,000 years after his death. But here is where the story turns dark and strange. Because immunity, as he would learn, is not always a gift. When Rome finally cornered him, when his own army turned against him and the walls of his palace began to close in like a trap, Mithridates made a decision. He would not be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. He would not become a trophy for his enemies. So he reached for the poison that had always been his faithful companion. He swallowed. And he waited. Nothing. Not a tremor. Not a cough. Not the slightest whisper of death. After years of seducing every toxin, every venom, every silent killer he could find, his body had become utterly unfaithful to his wishes. The one time he needed to die quietly, with dignity, the poisons refused to betray him. Imagine that final moment. The sound of Roman soldiers breaking down the outer gates. The flicker of torchlight through the windows. And the king, surrounded by empty vials, realizing that he had outlived his own exit strategy. So he turned to a mercenary standing in the shadows and, according to ancient sources, spoke just a few words. A request. A command. Something like, "Do it manually." And with a single sword thrust, the man who could not be killed by chemistry fell like anyone else. Sometimes the most intimate relationship you can have is with death itself. And sometimes, when you try too hard to control it, death finds another way. That was only the first of our epic endings. Our next story involves a philosopher, a donkey, and a laugh that never stopped. That was only the first of our epic endings. Our next story involves a philosopher, a donkey, and a laugh that never stopped. You see, there was once a man named Chrysippus, a thinker so devoted to logic and self-control that he helped shape the very foundations of Stoic philosophy. Stoics believed in mastering emotion, in enduring pain without a flinch, in facing the chaos of the world with a face of stone. Chrysippus wrote hundreds of books on ethics, on reason, on the proper way to live and die. And then, one ordinary afternoon, a donkey ate some figures. That is not a joke, though it will become one. The philosopher was watching, perhaps from a shaded courtyard, perhaps with a cup of wine in his hand. And for reasons no historian has ever fully explained, something about that sight, a simple animal chewing stolen fruit, struck him as the funniest thing he had ever witnessed. He began to laugh. Not a polite, restrained chuckle. A deep, shaking, tear-streaked laugh that came from somewhere primal and uncontrollable. His students gathered, confused at first, then amused, then alarmed. Because the laughter did not stop. It rolled through him like a wave that refused to break. His ribs ached. His breath shortened. His face turned red, then pale. And still, he could not stop. Imagine the intimacy of that moment. A man who had spent his entire life teaching others how to cage their emotions, suddenly undone by a donkey and a few figures. His own body, which he had trained to obey reason, now betraying him with something as simple and human as joy. Some say he collapsed right there, still smiling, his heart simply giving up under the weight of its own delight. Others claim he made it to his bed, still giggling, still gasping, until the final exhale came and did not return. A Stoic who died of laughter. There is a strange poetry in that. He had prepared for pain, for betrayal, for the sting of loss. But he had never prepared to be killed by a punchline. And so Chrysippus left this world the same way he entered it, surprised by the absurdity of everything. That is the trouble with mastering your emotions. Sometimes the one feeling you forget to lock away is the one that destroys you. But if you think dying from laughter is strange, wait until you hear about the Viking who was killed by a dead man's tooth. But if you think dying from laughter is strange, wait until you hear about the Viking who was killed by a dead man's tooth. His name was Sigurd the Mighty, a Norse earl who ruled the windswept Orkney Islands in the 9th century. He was a warrior of terrifying reputation, a man who had tasted blood on so many battlefields that the sea itself seemed to remember his name. And like all men of power, he had enemies. One of them was a Scottish noble called Maelbrigte, a chieftain with a famously crooked tooth that jutted from his jaw like a small white dagger. They fought a battle that was never meant to be fair. Sigurd brought twice as many men as he had promised. The massacre was absolute. And when the fighting ended, Sigurd did something that seemed not only victorious but almost intimate. He took Maelbrigte's severed head, tied it to his saddle by the hair, and began the long ride home. Imagine that ride. The sway of the horse, the weight of the dead man's skull bouncing against his leg with every hoofbeat. Perhaps he felt like a god. Perhaps he whispered jokes to his men about the enemy who could no longer answer. But there was a detail Sigurd had forgotten. That tooth. As the head swung back and forth, the jagged edge of Maelbrigte's tooth scraped against the Viking's calf. Just a scratch. Nothing a warrior would notice. Nothing a warrior would bother to clean. Days passed. The wound did not heal. Instead, it swelled, turning hot and angry, then dark. The flesh around it began to weep. In the 9th century, there were no antibiotics, no salves that could stop what was already spreading through his blood. Sigurd, the man who had won every battle, who had beheaded his rival and claimed victory, now lay in his hall burning with fever. His men watched as their mighty earl grew weaker, more confused, more human. And then he died. Killed not by a sword or an arrow, but by the tooth of a man whose head he had carried home like a trophy. There is something deeply unsettling about that. A dead man reaching out from beyond the grave to take his revenge with nothing but a crooked piece of enamel. Sigurd did not lose the battle. He won it. But the dead, as history reminds us, are patient. And sometimes the most dangerous thing about an enemy is not his army, but the smallest, most overlooked part of him that you carry with you. That is the price of arrogance. But as strange as a tooth can be, what happened to a Roman emperor named Valerian makes a dead man's scratch seem almost merciful. But as strange as a tooth can be, what happened to a Roman emperor named Valerian makes a dead man's scratch seem almost merciful. Valerian ruled Rome in the 3rd century, a time when the empire was cracking like old pottery. Plagues, civil wars, barbarian invasions, every day brought a new disaster. Still, Valerian believed he could restore glory. So he marched east to crush the Persian Empire, a kingdom ruled by a king named Shhh who had little patience for Roman arrogance. The battle was a catastrophe. Valerian's army was slaughtered. And the emperor himself was taken alive, a humiliation so rare that it sent shockwaves through the ancient world. Most captured rulers are ransomed or imprisoned. But Shhh had something darker in mind. He saw not a noble enemy, but a tool. And so Valerian, the man who had worn the purple robes of divine authority, was forced to kneel. Whenever Shhh mounted his horse, the emperor of Rome was brought out to serve as a human footstool. Imagine that scene. The Persian king swinging his leg over the saddle, his boot pressing down on the back of a man who had once commanded legions. The whispers of courtiers. The silence of Roman envoys who could do nothing but watch. For years, this was Valerian's existence, not death, but a living humiliation that stripped away every last shred of dignity. And when his body finally gave out, when the years of degradation and starvation ended his suffering, Shhh was not finished. According to the most haunting accounts, the Persian king ordered Valerian's skin removed, his flesh discarded, and his hide stuffed with straw. The former emperor, now nothing more than a hollow figure, was displayed in a Persian temple as a war trophy. A warning to Rome. A monument to what happens when pride meets a crueler will. There is something profoundly disturbing about that fate. Not the violence of it, but the intimacy. To be emptied out, filled with dry grass, and put on display like a hunting prize. Valerian did not die in battle. He did not fall to poison or a blade. He was unmade slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a skin full of straw. Rome never officially acknowledged what happened. They pretended he had simply disappeared. But history remembers. And history whispers that some deaths are not endings. They are messages. That was the last of our epic exits tonight. For men. For strange, terrible, unforgettable ways to leave this world. Which one haunted you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories from the darker corners of the past, subscribe to Little Historical. Because the dead, as we have seen, never truly stop speaking.